So for this lecture, we're going to talk about the presidencies of the 1970s and some of their significances. I'm also going to recommend that you pause in some of these parts so that you watch some of the videos that will go with what we're talking about. Okay, so let's talk about, the presidency of Richard Nixon. First of all, because he really starts off in the 1970s, really he gets elected in 1968. But he is president number 37, and he's elected again, like I said, in 1968. He's going to be reelected again in 1972. Now, keep in mind what I talked about Richard Nixon. Remember, his loss to John F. Kennedy in the 1960 election is really going to paint his character specifically with political rivals. So that's going to give you a little bit of insight into him, okay? So he was a very seasoned politician. He was a congressman from California, but he was also vice president under Eisenhower, who was an incredibly, very popular president at that time. So when he does run for presidency, he assures that he is going to win it, and he has a specific strategy. He doesn't want to have the same, failure and an assumption that he's going to win the election like he did in the 1960 election. So he focuses on the people in the South, really, and they were called the silent majority. And I know that in today's politics, that silent majority is being used again a lot different than they were during that time. These are mainly like the blue collar Southern whites, and a lot of these were the Democrats, traditional Democrats that he draws in. So this is really where we see a change in the political party to where we see the more modern politics really match up with it was during this election. They called themselves the Dixiecrats. They were really, what we would consider today Republicans. But during that time, he also nominates Spiro Agnew. And so to gather, more Southern white votes. And so this is who he targets specifically are the people maybe that aren't as loud. And 1960s, we see quite a bit of civil rights movements and people speaking out quite a bit during this time period. So that's why he kind of coins that term, the silent majority. Okay, so during his presidency, he kind of establishes something known as the New Federalism. Now, this is a pretty centrist view, not very super right-winged. We're not going to see more of that modern conservatism until Reagan's election, after 1980s. Now, he establishes some things that we would see maybe today as more liberal. So environmental protection, worker protections, things like that. But he also establishes the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. That's going to set the tone for the 1980s when there's the war on drugs, right, with Reagan and with H.W. Bush. But he does want to give the states a little bit more power for social issues. He's got kind of a mixed civil rights record in general. He does support Social Security and Medicare, and quite honestly, particularly Social Security has always pretty much been a bipartisan supported program. So that's really what he does. One of the things that you know Nixon for sure should get credit for as president is his success in opening up relations with China. Now remember, 1949, Mao Zedong has taken over China, and the United States refuses to recognize them. Okay. And he has a different viewpoint. He definitely caters to this idea of detente and opening up, relaxing tensions. And he believed that it was okay to have different ideologies and still kind of work together, right? We can still help each other out politically and economically. So very famously, he makes a visit to China in 1971. This is seen as like a great success. It was highly publicized on both parts. It opens up economic trade with us in China. And now, today, China is the biggest consumer of our farming products here in the United States. So our farmers very much depend on the Chinese exports, right? And so there's all kinds of, and plus I know that a lot of our manufactured goods come from China. So we have had a very positive trading relationship. But at this point, you should pause the video and you should watch the video clip on Nixon's visit to China. So that will give you a little bit more insight. So be sure to do that. Okay, so just like I mentioned, the policy of detente Nixon is going to open up talks with a lot of the communist countries. And so one thing is that, China, he visited China, opened up talks. And so the Soviet Union, decided, hey, we want to talk to Richard Nixon too. So he makes a trip to the Soviet Union and they establish something known as the SALT Treaty, which is a reduction, stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, but it reduces ballistic missiles, all kinds of nuclear weapons. So this is where we really see the change in policy. We move away from containment and massive retaliation, and now we're moving towards more relaxed tensions, with uh, with communist organizations. Okay, so another big issue that happened in the 70s, and this is going to plague all of the presidents of the 1970s, is the issue of oil. Now, an organization that's actually still there today, it's actually an oligarchy really, is OPEC. So OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And essentially what it is it's a group of countries that that essentially set the prices of all of the oil in the world, right? So they decide how much they're going to produce, how many barrels they're going to produce, and what they're going to charge. And that's why people are so extremely sensitive about setting the oil prices, right? And any kind of stirrups in the Middle East might lead to, oil prices increasing. And in fact, that's the thing that really sets off the oil crisis in the 1970s was the Arab-Israeli crisis in 1973. Little background, obviously. Israel becomes a state by the United Nations, established there as a place of refuge for Jews after World War II. So that happens in 1945, and there's a constant conflict, and even obviously in the new state, it still continues, right? It was in constant conflict, and in 1973 was the massive war, and America supports Israel as it has since its establishment in 1945. And so, for that reason, because we supported them in that war, OPEC slapped an oil embargo on the United States, and that really shoots up oil prices and creates quite a crisis. So, there's a video clip that is really important for you to watch. So, make sure you pause the video and you watch that video, you watch that video because that'll be super helpful to you. All right, so Nixon as a president, he really does try to help the economy. He tries to freeze wages and everything, but we go through a period of something known as stagflation. Okay, and so actually, in stagflation is a mixture of inflation and a recession at the same time, mixed with the oil crisis. It created a huge economic issue that really begins in the 1970s, and one that Ford and Carter after him are not able to really dig themselves out of. But of course, the thing that Nixon is really known for, right, is Watergate and the Watergate scandal, which is one of the biggest presidential scandals in American history. So there's a video clip that I highly encourage you to watch that really explains it. You might even want to watch it before I explain this because what I explain might be a little convoluted and a little difficult to understand, but the video does a very good job of describing what happens, okay? So remember what I told you before. Think about the psyche of Nixon, right? He is very paranoid to lose. He didn't expect to lose to Kennedy, and that really plagues him. And so, he does win in 1968, but not as much of a margin as he wanted to. Okay, so I'm kind of setting the stage here. Well, in June of 1972, there was a burglary at the Democratic National Committee. And what they found, there were burglars that were in there, and the burglars actually were trying to adjust some videos that or I'm sorry, not videos, but like little bugs, like hearing bugs. And really at the beginning it didn't really receive much attention, okay? But when they start kind of unraveling Watergate, they start to realize that these burglars were attached to Nixon's presidential administration, okay? And they were actually attached to something called, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of it, but basically it was an acronym for the reelecting the president. And so once they were tied to that, one by one, it starts to unravel. And historians still argue today, was Nixon directly involved in the cover up of this botched burglary and to try to, I guess, hide or find secret information about the Democratic National Committee and find out what they had. But pretty quickly, there were two particular Washington Post reporters that begin to really unravel and uncover the cover up, right? And really end up tying this to Nixon's administration. They have a secret informant, and I think just recently, right, it was revealed that he was actually a top FBI official. And so there was a real crisis on our hands. Is the federal government going to investigate Nixon? Um, would the Supreme Court demand Nixon to turn over some secret tapes apparently that he had? And that was another thing. During this event, they found out during their investigation, the Washington Post reporters, they found out that Nixon actually had tapes. He would secretly tape every conversation that he had in the White House. This is part of his paranoia. And so, even though they're not able to necessarily say that he definitely made he had them go in and do this bugging of the Democratic National Committee, what they are definitely able to eventually prove is that he was definitely involved in covering it up. Okay, so the Supreme Court does demand that they turn it over, and the Congress does investigate it. It goes through about, 2 years of a trial. So Nixon does try to claim executive privilege. The Supreme Court does force him to overturn and turn it over his tapes. And it turns out Nixon was a little hesitant, but there were Republicans that basically told him that he needed to resign before he got kicked out. And so he does resign. He becomes our first president. He's never impeached. They were starting to put together the impeachment papers, but he resigns before any of that happens. And so Watergate can really be looked at one of two ways, right? Does it reveal how corrupt the presidency could really be? And how far up it went and cover-ups, or does it reveal that the three-branch system works, right? Does it reveal that we're going to hold people accountable? Either way, it's just one of those moments in history. Okay, so interestingly enough, the guy I told you about before, Spiro Agnew, he actually ends up resigning before Nixon does because he's pretty directly tied to Watergate and a lot of other scandals. And so during that time, if a vice president steps down, just like any other cabinet position, the president would recommend somebody, nominate somebody, and that would go through the Senate and Congress. So that person that became vice president was a man named Gerald Ford, who was a seasoned congressman. Interestingly enough, this means that when Nixon resigns, Ford becomes president, and Ford was never elected. Okay, so who was Ford? Let's talk about Ford next. So he was obviously president 38. And he was a former football star, really well liked guy in general. He was in the Navy and World War II vet. He was a seasoned congressman. And so, he knew, though, that the presidency was heavily damaged. And so when he enters, he says, I assume the presidency under extraordinary circumstances. This is an hour of history that troubles our minds and hurts our hearts. Okay, so one of the first things that he does as president, quite controversially, is that he pardons Nixon. Okay? Before you get all up in arms about pardoning Nixon, and I understand that, right? I think one of the big reasons why what really was because he thought the country was absolutely obsessed with the Watergate scandal. People couldn't focus on anything else. There were a lot of other issues going on, right? We're still in the middle of the Cold War. We have massive economic issues, but all anybody could really focus on was, was the Nixon Watergate scandal. And so he does pardon Nixon. And I encourage you to listen to the congressional hearing, which Congress called him before Congress to discuss why did you pardon him, and listen to his argument and see, what you think about that. But either way, really because of Watergate, possibly because of the pardoning too, Republicans lose a lot of power in Congress in the next election, and Ford is not going to be reelected. Okay. But to his defense, again, there were a lot of, issues, economic issues that he inherits that he's just not able to dig himself out of. He does try a program he calls WIN, which was whip inflation now, but it absolutely, it doesn't work. Okay. He does have some success in the foreign policy arena. He does continue more SALT talks. So SALT 2, SALT 3. Um, and so generally speaking, he does try to ease that, okay? However, there was a mass genocide happening in Cambodia. You guys might remember Cambodia from the Vietnam lecture. So that was the country that's right next to Vietnam and essentially falls to communism, okay? So, and there's also massive genocide that occurs when they take over there. But so he has, I guess some sort of mix since Cambodia, if you can consider Cambodia, but in general, he did a lot to try to reduce nuclear weapons. Okay, so he's not going to win the next election, right? He's president for a very short time. He's only president for 2 years, really, because Nixon steps down in 1974. And so Ford becomes president. I'm sorry, Jimmy Carter becomes president and he is a Democrat. Okay, so he's totally different. Jimmy Carter was a peanut farmer, from Georgia, and he wasn't a seasoned politician. And so, and possibly that's really what the people were looking for at that time, right? And he was very casual. He was a Sunday school teacher, by the way, which today he's still around. He's our longest living former president ever. He's like 90 in his late mid 90s, and he's in Georgia and he still teaches Sunday school. He's super, super lovable. But as a president, he had sort of a mixed record, right? He's only going to be president for one term. But he doesn't have like as much political savvy, and that really gets in the way a lot with things he tries to accomplish. Plus the fact that a lot of Congress has really turned and has started to become more Republican, and it makes it very difficult if you're a president who is, Republican and there's Democrats in Congress or vice versa. It makes it very difficult to push forward any kind of agenda if you don't have that with you. Okay. One of the things that he does that's controversial, and pretty somewhat controversial at that time, was that he pardoned Vietnam vets that were draft dodgers. Okay? Now, you have to think about our lecture on Vietnam. Vietnam was not a popular war. The country was hurting from Vietnam. And so the fact that, anybody who evaded the draft could get out of a 10-year sentence of evading the draft made some people upset. But others, they thought, it was the right move because it was an unjust war. We shouldn't have gotten involved in it. And we needed to move on and heal, as a country. And so somewhat controversial when he does that. He's going to really have a lot of trouble with the economy, much like Ford does. It absolutely continues. Inflation is continuing. The cost of oil is continuing. He tries to get a gas tax passed, but that doesn't work. So, economically, things are not so good. Another thing that he does, and this has actually still received quite a bit of criticism today, is something called the Community Reinvestment Act. And that was saying, and this comes from the redlining that was happening. So if you're not familiar with redlining is, during the 1950s and 60s, the banks would literally outline anybody that they felt like an area that was, lower socioeconomic, like risky investment. And a lot of them, they actually, your banks were physically located there, but they didn't give loans out to people. And so in an effort to try to get, and a lot of, by the way, these people, when they were redlining, it was districts where you had minorities, blacks, and you had Latinos and places like that. So obviously the redlining was seen as like a pretty racist way for banks to do business, right? Because they wouldn't give loans out to anybody that lived in that area. And so basically, they said in the Community Reinvestment Act, um, Carter basically said that if you are in that area, you're in that neighborhood, you have to accept deposits and give out loans in that area. Now, some people blame this Community Reinvestment Act in the 2007-2008 mortgage crisis that happened. Whether or not you believe that, a lot of people do tie it to this. Okay, switching gears, we'll talk about the foreign issues and foreign affairs that Carter had to deal with. And this was somewhat mixed, okay? So, one thing to understand is that in 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan to take over communists, okay? In response to this, like they suspend SALT, they impose sanctions on Russia, and we boycott the 1980 Olympics because it was going to be held in Moscow. Okay, and so Carter himself was a big believer, and he continues to be a big believer in human rights. Okay, and so this becomes like very upsetting to him. Side note, um, you may or may not know this, some of you may know this, but in the 1980s, the CIA gets involved in this, and they actually begin equipping a group in Afghanistan to fight off communism. They don't, if this is a CIA operation, so it's top secret, but they give them weapons, they train these people, and the people eventually do get the communists out. Those people are known as the Taliban, Al Qaeda. Okay, and so um, believe it or not, we did equip. And later on, in the 2000s when we're fighting, the war on terror, the people in Afghanistan, the Taliban, were actually using weapons that were given to them by the CIA, ironically enough. And there's a lot stemmed in that. Like a lot of their hatred was because we eventually leave them with no way to really rebuild their country after that. So anyway, a lot there, that's kind of really digressing, but this upsets Carter, and that's essentially how he reacts. So the next thing that happens is the Panama Canal, which was once under the control of the United States. If you remember our lecture on American imperialism and the building of the Panama Canal, and so Carter negotiates to give the Panama Canal back to the Panamanians, slated it for 1999, and in fact, we did give them back control of it. Okay, a lot of people weren't happy about that. They felt that it would threaten shipping, but Carter, huge humanitarian, even to this day, just believed that that was the right thing to do. So one of the things, and this is probably like the shining moment of the Carter administration, was the Camp David Accords. He's the first president to bring the Arab and Israelis together to try to knock out some sort of peace negotiation and armistice, putting down the weapons. And so it happens in Camp David, which is in Maryland. And they use Camp David. It's kind of like this top secret place, but it's very remote in Maryland, and a lot of presidents now host foreign dignitaries there, and it's really modeled after what Carter did. But they did, the oil embargo was an issue, so Carter himself organizes this peace talk, and eventually the Egyptian president and Israeli prime minister do come to an agreement. Egypt is the first Arab country to formally recognize Egypt. I'm not Egypt, Israel, and it's a success. Okay, now there's gonna be obviously other tensions that are continuing in Israel even today, but this is the first time there's really any kind of peace talk, so it's seen as like successful. But the thing that really plagued Jimmy Carter's end of his presidency was the Iran hostage crisis. So I want to say that there is a video clip at the end that you really should watch, and it leads right into Reagan's presidency. So that's very important. And one of the movie choices that you guys have is one called Argo, and it's all about the Iran hostage crisis. But eventually, there was a kind of a corrupt leader that was supported by the United States, known as the Shah, right? He supported the U.S., but a lot of the Iranians wanted him out, and they eventually do get him out, and he's exiled. Well, while he's in exile, he gets cancer, and he's still kind of friends with the U.S. So the United States allows the Shah in to get cancer treatment. Now, people get absolutely upset. And I should say, side note, they also elected Ayatollah Khomeini to take power. He's a fundamentalist Shiite Muslim. And so anyway, Carter allows the Shah to come into the country, and out of anger, some students invaded the American embassy in Iran and took 66 hostages. Okay, and they're hostages for over 400 days, and they're not released until Reagan's inauguration day. Now, Khomeini actually doesn't take the hostages. And it wasn't his idea, but when he saw like the support that the country gave and the reaction of the U.S., he kind of takes control and takes over in credit of those hostages. Okay, so that's really what ends Carter's presidency. Not a great way to really end it, but either way, you know, you can't argue that he wasn't a great humanitarian. All right, so that's it. That's all I have for the 1970s presidencies. So the next thing that I'm going to recommend is you to watch a video on Reagan. And so that's on the next module. But other than that, make sure you watch the video clip on the Iran hostage crisis. If you didn't watch the other video clips, they're going to provide you with a lot of context, and I highly recommend them. All right, thank you very much.